Amen. And thank you so much to Joyce Rosenzweig and to Judy Ribnick for leading services tonight. And thank you, everyone, wherever you are and from whichever place and whatever your setting is, joining us for Shabbat services tonight. And now we turn to some words of Torah. On this, the first Shabbat after Pesach, the fifth Shabbat of our new normal. And it is the Shabbat that anticipates the month of Iyar, which comes in this coming week, as we mentioned. And it is as it is between between Pesach and this next holiday of Shavuot. It starts us on our journey, which moves from Pesach to Shavuot. We are starting, as we did on the second night of the Seder, the counting of the Omer, literally counting each step on the ladder that will take us from this time of Pesach, when we physically are told our people got out of slavery, into the moment of Shavuot, where we experienced revelation. So I want to spend a few moments tonight just asking the question, what is revelation? What are we moving towards as we move these 7 weeks of 7 days? And that's what the Omer counts, these 7 weeks of 7 days to the Omer, to Shavuot. What is revelation? So let's talk about revelation for a moment. So Shavuot, first of all, means weeks, because it is this holiday that's of the counting of the weeks. And it is the only holiday that we don't have an exact date in the Bible of the biblical holidays. We're just told it's 49 days after the day, and which is the day we start counting is complicated. But once you've decided which is the day you start counting, it's 49 days from then. So we know for sure that Shavuot itself is deeply connected to the holiday of Pesach. They're like bookends, or even more profound. They're connected by this string of time and space and humanity. And our job during these 7 weeks of 7 days is to uncover the gooey stuff that connects between Pesach and Shavuot. So, the question of revelation. Revelation, of course, the English word to reveal means something is revealed. It doesn't necessarily mean something sacred or holy or divine, but it has come to mean that in English for when we talk about it, for these moments of the story of Exodus and Sinai and the revelation of God on Mount Sinai, etc. What then is the Hebrew word for revelation? If you know it, put it in the chat. Put it into the chats, so I can see. What's the word for revelation? Anybody know the word for revelation in Hebrew? And what is the root of the word for revelation in Hebrew? And what other words exist in Hebrew that use the same 3-letter root? Or it might be 2, but I'm gonna leave that off for a more complicated discussion of grammar, which I love, but not for tonight. So the Hebrew word for revelation, hitgalut, is from the same shoresh as the word galut, and it's the same shoresh as the word gil or gilah. So what are these 3 words? The first one, hitgalut, is to be revealed, which is from the same word as exile, which is from the same word, and I mean by word, I mean shoresh, the root. They all share the roots for happiness. Wow, these are 3 really interesting words that share a root in Hebrew. So the word for revelation, first of all, shares the root for the word of exile, galut. And that has always fascinated me, and it fascinates many scholars and many people who comment on these things. It is so interesting that throughout history, and not only the history of our people as Jews, but all different religious traditions, that profound revelation, or let's use another word, discovery, or I'm watching now the comments. Harold is telling us that late Latin revelation means lay bare, to bring something out, to remove the obstacles to seeing something. Hitgalut is to make something visible or awareness. So it can mean and the connection to the word for exile, galut, is interesting to me. So I was saying all these traditions talk about the relationship between deep understanding, profound epiphany, and being in some kind of exile. And by exile, I don't only mean political exile. I mean being away from the tumult of everyday life. So, for instance, we are told that Moses experienced the burning bush, which you could think about as his personal Mount Sinai. And Rashi loves to make the connection between Sinai, the Hebrew word for Sinai, and Sneh, the Hebrew word for a burning bush. So Moses encounters his Sneh, his Sinai, his moment of epiphany. Where is he? It says he's Achar HaMidbar. He's so far into the Midbar, he's away from civilization. He's a shepherd, and he's away in a place where he can contemplate and ponder and reflect without the busyness of his everyday life. And it's in that moment we're told that Moses can have an epiphany, can understand the truth. We might call it divine truth, transcendent truth, deep truth that gives him some deep knowledge, some deep understanding that he did not have before. That's a form of revelation. That's a personal kind of revelation. All of us, I'm sure, have experienced it. All of us have experienced that, I imagine. Especially, I'll think of a personal experience of coming out as those of us who are LGBT. The moments of becoming aware of a deep truth is a moment of revelation. It's a moment of deep truth. And others of you can think about moments in which you've experienced that. Where have you been that you've been able to have the epiphany? What are the conditions that you have to create in your life, or looking back historically in your life? What have been the conditions in which you've been able to have a new insight, a profound new thought that changed something about the way you saw yourself or you saw the world? It could be as an artist. What does an artist do? How and when does an artist experience an insight? Or a scholar, or an athlete? Where does that insight, the moment of shift from thinking one way to having a new and profound revelation? I'm going to use the word revelation. I think it often comes, not only comes, but often comes when we're in a place of exile. I think of Hermann Hesse's book, Siddhartha. Where, of course, was the Buddha when the Buddha did his sitting and thinking and transforming his understanding of the world in which he lived? What are the moments in which throughout the story, Joseph Campbell talks about the story of the hero? One major point in the hero's story, cross-culturally and multiculturally, is that this hero is on a journey, and part of the journey includes being away from the familiar. Abraham is told, Lech lecha ma'artzecha. God tells him you have to leave everything familiar to become the person you need to be to save your people. Moses goes through it in our story. We have Joseph do it. All the different examples that exist within our tradition exist likewise multiculturally throughout cultures and throughout religious traditions. So I want to offer this connection between revelation, between having an epiphany. Mount Sinai, of course, is in the middle of the desert, the midbar, the sense where there isn't the busyness of civilization. That's where God chose to give the Torah. Not in the middle of Jerusalem or not downtown Alexandria, but in the middle of the desert where there is a sense of emptiness and a place we need that spaciousness in order to see deep, holy, sacred truth. I don't think it's a coincidence at all that the holiness of the desert is a place that has launched, and we've discussed this in my Psalms class a lot, the role of mountains as holy and places of God's presence in many, many different traditions. The sacred mountain being a very significant place where one is separated from. So the third meaning, of course, is Gil or Gilah, the same shoresh of happiness. So isn't that a fantastic connection, that revelation or discovery can happen in a place of exile where we might think this is a terrible thing that we've been exiled, and in fact, deep and profound truths are discovered or created. The great Babylonian Talmud was created in exile in Babylonia. And then the third meaning of the root is happiness, that one can feel happiness even in exile if one can find a way of experiencing deep truth and deep discovery and deep revelation. This past week, I asked on Facebook a very simple question inspired by my colleague who asked the same question, Rabbi Michael Latz from Minnesota, where Judy is also originally from. In these 4 weeks of quarantine, what have you discovered? And that's the question I want to ask ourselves tonight. In these now 4, or for some of us 5 weeks of quarantine, what revelation, what discovery have you made? What discovery have you made? I want to read some of those that were offered on Facebook in answer to that question and invite you to offer your discoveries in these 4 or 5 weeks of the exile we are in, so to speak, of the galut we are experiencing by being not far away in galut, but we've had to retreat into our personal homes, and that has been a certain form of galut. So what is the discoveries we've had? I'm going to read a few of these, and then I invite you to offer them on Facebook, and I'll read a few out loud as well. What have you discovered? Sariel Beckenstein writes that we should have quarantined earlier. Eve Miller, I have a new cousin whose daughter is a rabbi. Michael Rabinowitz, I'm more mentally balanced in trying times than in good times. I miss the people I don't even like. The lockdown made me think about the question, if everyone in the world was like me, would the world be a better place? At that point, I realized I needed to do tshuva. Gail writes that I can live with somebody 24/7 as difficult as it can be. Carol Feynman, I'm trying to do a massive cleanup, and I opened an Amazon box from a year ago. I found an order of 6 pairs of socks today. Carol writes, I've gotten tired of MSNBC. Also, I have discovered I don't really like wearing shoes. Lori writes, I found I'm grateful to live in the suburbs so I can go walking with a friend 10 feet apart, enjoy nature, and get some human contact. Logan writes, depression comes back like a boomerang. Rebecca Rosenbaum writes, widowhood and pandemic are not a good combo. I love to be alone together. I know I've learned I'm not a good hermit. If I find a good show on Netflix, I like to watch it again. I hate solitary. Sarah writes, guilt and sense of protection are my overwhelming feelings. I want to protect my staff, chaplains in the hospital. I feel guilty for possibly exposing them. And now I'm in quarantine, even more guilty of who I interacted with. Judy writes, I discovered I realized that I had a pretty good life despite chronic illness before this pandemic. I could eat and shop where I wanted. I could travel. I wonder if life will ever be the same. For now, however, I am fine being home, decluttering many areas. Jonathan writes, I've discovered a lot of immature conversations about my shame and mature conversations about my love and passions. Shelley writes, bras and pants don't really matter. Laurel writes, I like living alone. I'm a pretty good cook. I like my own cooking, and I want more cats. Irene discovers in her revelations, I did too much food shopping in my past life and spent too much on non-essentials. I need spirituality, but not formal religion. I've discovered I have more friends than I thought, and I want to give attention to them. Art. I've discovered art. Art. More art. Someone else writes they've discovered the sewing machine. Tuvi writes, I don't really like people. So now I'm going to read some of the things that you've offered tonight as part of our service. Sarah writes, I've discovered that I can be totally at peace with being alone with me. Marco, I discovered that my past adversities have made me stronger and have prepared me for a situation like this. Judy, I don't have to shower so often. Meryl, I've discovered I really don't like being alone. Chana, our cats can really live without our company. Miguel, I discovered how much I love my boyfriend and how much I need him. Stacy, I miss the sense of touch. Yolanda, how little we really need to live. How little we really need in order to live day to day. Judy, I'm not missing being touched. Is there something wrong with me? I discovered so much. I fear we will stop hugging altogether. Bobby, if only we were as willing during normal times to try, fail, and they try again with as much patience, grace, and understanding as we are forced to do now. Rosemarie, how much more I can do to reach out and how to help. Wendy, how much gratitude I have. Thank you so much. There are so many more. Keep writing those. What are our revelations while we are in exile? What are our discoveries? Good ones and bad ones, neutral ones, funny ones, poignant, sad, depressing. All of them are a part of God's truth. And I believe that as we deepen our ability to ask ourselves from this exile, and this is such a Jewish question, from this galut, what hitgalut will I find? From this exile, what discovery, what revelation of God's presence will I discover? And from which one of those revelations will I actually experience happiness? So I pray for all of you to experience this moment of exile as our ancestors have experienced exiles in their generations. Our exile is different. We are not being sent away, we are sent inside. But as we move from Pesach to Shavuot, from a moment of liberation from slavery but not yet experiencing revelation, let's keep focusing on the things we can learn from exile to teach us about what freedom really is. My blessings to all of you on this Shabbat and for this week to come. Shabbat Shalom.